Welcome to Christian Podcast, where we look at the world and our own lives through a Christian lens.
And we are definitely launching into a very significant deep dive today. It tackles something complex and, frankly, pretty consequential.
That's right. Today we're looking closely at events that have, really dominated the conversation for months now. The death of Charlie Kirk and what many are calling this conservative awakening.
We're specifically focusing our analysis on a key paper, The Inevitable Awakening. From Charlie Kirk's death to a global conservative resurgence, and also bringing in some related commentary that provides context.
Yeah, and our goal here isn't just to, recount what happened. It's deeper than that.
Exactly. We want to unpack how this specific, very symbolic tragedy combined with a nearly simultaneous high-level institutional action. The sources we're looking at argue this created a kind of structural possibility, a window, maybe.
A window, yeah, for potentially a really profound and lasting shift culturally and politically.
That's the core assertion, isn't it? These two events in September 2025, Kirk's assassination and the U.S. president's speech at the UN, they didn't just happen one after the other.
Right. The analysis says they intertwined. They formed an emotional catalytic point and an institutional authorization point.
Mm-hmm. And it's this combination, this sort of 1-2 punch that these analysts claim has opened the door for a potential reshaping of global conservatism over, say, the next 20 or 30 years.
Wow. So it's like this intense public grief got an immediate green light, almost from the highest levels of power.
That's a good way to put it. Translating that moral fervor, that grief, into institutional permission. That's the crux of it.
Okay, so let's start by unpacking that first event, the emotional trigger. Charlie Kirk's assassination during that campus speech back in September 2025. The violence itself was shocking, obviously.
Absolutely. But the sources really emphasize how it was framed almost instantly, spiritually and politically.
That framing, it seems key to turning what could have been seen as just, a horrific act of violence into something more meaningful, structurally significant.
Precisely. It was immediately contextualized using that biblical parable, the one often linked to Paul, from John 12:24. A grain of wheat falls to the earth and dies. If it dies, it bears much fruit. And using that reference, according to the analysis, right away lifted it. It wasn't just a political killing anymore. It became this public sacrifice, loaded with religious and political meaning.
And I guess the sources are arguing that in today's world, with so much secularization, maybe a kind of spiritual searching and definitely value relativism.
Yeah.
An event like that, framed as martyrdom, it has immense symbolic power.
Huge power. It offers a focal point, It captures this massive emotional capital because it provides a narrative, a tragic, heroic narrative for people maybe feeling adrift, politically or culturally.
Right, people feeling ignored or scattered, perhaps.
Yeah. It gives them something very concrete, very sadly noble to rally around. It takes all that vague cultural frustration and focuses it, turns it into motivated action.
And we saw that focus immediately, didn't we, in the societal response. The analysis talks about a shift from just general dissatisfaction, that low-level grumbling we've kind of seen building into something specific. Focused moral outrage. Can you elaborate on that difference? What does focused mean here?
Well, diffuse dissatisfaction is, politically pretty passive. People might complain, maybe they don't vote. But focused moral outrage, that's active. It demands action. It creates immediate social pressure, demands political answers now.
Because one of their own, a key young voice, was silenced violently.
Exactly. That sense of injustice became the fuel, the engine for mobilization.
And alongside that outrage, there was this parallel tracking the evidence of a religious awakening. The source material makes a pretty extraordinary claim here, suggesting it wasn't just a fleeting moment of public grief.
Yeah, the evidence they cite is quite compelling. Not just, big crowds at rallies, but measurable changes in religious behavior. Reports of massive public mourning, huge memorials, yes, but also, significantly, a considerable increase. That's the phrase used in young people actually going to church, reading the Bible, attending religious gatherings right after the event.
So it wasn't just political reaction. It felt like a genuine religious re-engagement for many.
That's what the data seem to suggest, yeah.
And that dynamic, that surge, is why some analysts are even starting to talk about a potential third Great Awakening. For listeners maybe not familiar with that term from history, what's the significance of that comparison?
Well, the previous Great Awakenings in American history, think the first, the second, maybe the mid-20th century movements, these were periods of really widespread, intense religious revival. And they didn't just change personal faith, they profoundly reshaped society. Social norms, political reforms like abolitionism fueled by the Second Awakening, national identity.
So suggesting a third implies something potentially just as transformative, not just a temporary blip.
Exactly. It implies a sustained period of deep moral and religious reflection that could potentially translate into major institutional changes. It frames this moment as possibly a fundamental reorientation of American moral and civic life, a really big claim.
A staggering claim. Okay, so you had this powerful emotional trigger, the sacrifice activating latent feelings, religious fervor. But like you said, emotion alone doesn't usually sustain a shift for decades.
No, it needs structure. It needs legitimacy.
Which brings us right to that second catalyst, the institutional authorization piece.
Precisely. The emotion needs translating. And just weeks after Kirk's death, you have the U.S. president stepping onto the biggest world stage possible, the UN General Assembly, the UNGA, and delivering a very pointed speech.
And the language was really specific, wasn't it? Especially for that venue. Defending free speech, religious liberty, and specifically calling for the protection of Christianity, framing it as one of the most persecuted religions today.
That language, in that place, provided what the sources call high-level legitimacy. The choice of the UN, the head of states saying those words, it acted like a massive amplifier.
Signaling that the grief and outrage felt by conservatives wasn't just a domestic issue anymore.
Exactly. It was now being framed as a national security concern, even a foreign policy priority.
Okay, so what does that language authorization actually do in practical terms? How does a speech at the UN change things for, say, a local church group or a political activist?
It gives the movement significant institutional weight chain. Think about the ripple effects. When the president uses that kind of language internationally, it validates the idea of a threat to religion liberty, right? Which then justifies shifting priorities systemically.
Awesome.
Well, domestically, it could mean faster judicial appointments, shifting government funds towards faith-based programs, maybe new executive orders on education policy. Internationally, it starts shaping diplomacy. Maybe aid or trade deals get linked to how other countries treat religious freedom, or pressure gets put on nations seen as falling short.
So it's not just words of support. It's providing the political cover, the leverage, to start actually changing how government machinery works, steering it towards the movement's goals.
Precisely. It converts this powerful but maybe initially isolated emotional event into a sanctioned national, even international project.
It gives permission almost for the movement to operate at higher levels of power.
Yes, and transforms their domestic religious concerns into something seen as a core national interest. That combination, the raw emotion of sacrifice meeting this high-level policy endorsement, that's what the analysis argues makes this moment so potent, so potentially long-lasting.
Okay, let's really dig into this now. The sources use this very strong word, inevitable, to describe the potential shift. That implies these forces are kind of locked in, doesn't it?
Well, inevitable in political analysis usually means the structural conditions are so strongly aligned that a particular outcome becomes the most probable one, unless something really unexpected happens, like an internal collapse or a major external shock.
Got it. So what are the specific mechanisms, the dynamics driving this probability? The sources lay out four.
Right. The first one is what we've just been discussing in depth. Emotional catalysis and symbolic magnification.
Right, how the spectacle, the violence gets channeled into a single powerful story for everyone.
Exactly. We live in a time, the analysis argues, where traditional sources of meaning might feel weaker for some people. So there's this hunger for narrative coherence. A tragedy framed as a sacrifice delivers that almost instantly.
It gives people a hero, a martyr, a clear cause to rally around.
And it focuses public attention intensely, encouraging people to re-identify with the values that martyr represented in this case, conservative faith-based values. The energy of grief gets transformed very quickly into the energy of allegiance, of belonging.
But that energy needs somewhere to go, right? It can just fizzle out.
Which brings us directly to the second dynamic, and this one is absolutely vital for making it last. Organizational readiness.
The idea that this awakening didn't just happen in a vacuum. It landed on fertile ground.
Fertile and prepared ground. Crucial point. This movement didn't start from scratch. It benefited from decades of infrastructure building. Think about it. A vast network of conservative churches, well-organized evangelical communities, a very sophisticated conservative media ecosystem, including online networks, established campus groups.
So when the emotional spark hit,
The machinery was already oiled and ready to run. They didn't need months to figure out how to organize.
they're described as mature mobilization mechanisms.
That's the term. They can instantly pivot. They can take that raw grief, that outrage, and channel it into organized action almost overnight. Email lists, rallies, media campaigns, lobbying efforts directed at specific lawmakers. It's all ready to go.
So there's this synergy. The event creates the narrative, which plugs right into existing mobilization channels. It's like a feedback loop.
Exactly. That's what prevents the initial energy from just dissipating. It gets channeled immediately towards concrete political and cultural objectives.
And then that channeled energy gets boosted, legitimized by the third dynamic, political leadership legitimization. We talked about the UN speech, but how does the analysis see the systemic impact of that kind of top-level validation?
Systemically, it works to shift the entire political conversation, what's sometimes called the Overton window, the range of acceptable ideas in public discourse. When the head of state takes these moral claims onto the world stage, the movement gains a kind of institutional influence that it likely didn't have before.
Can you give a concrete example of how that influence might play out in actual policy?
Sure. Domestically, you might see a real shift in legislative priorities. Maybe less focus on social issues framed as progressive, more on restorationist policies. Think about budgets, perhaps, grants for cultural programs seen as secular get cut, and that money moves towards initiative promoting traditional family structures or religious education.
Okay.
Diplomatically, as we touched on, the U.S. might start using its influence aid, trade pressure, to push international bodies, maybe like the UN Human Rights Council, towards what the sources call a sovereignty-first, tradition-emphasizing agenda. That could directly reshape global norms and priorities. It's about controlling the agenda at a high level.
Okay, now the fourth dynamic is where it gets really global, connecting this U.S. event to a potential worldwide trend, global transmission and mimicry. How does that work? How does a tragedy in the U.S. fuel conservatism globally?
It's a diffusion process, happening on a few levels. First, just the sheer reach of American media and culture. The story, the narrative of sacrifice and awakening gets beamed around the world instantly.
Okay, so awareness spreads.
Then you have existing international conservative networks, think tanks, political parties, religious groups, plus immigrant communities acting like transmission belts. They pick up the narrative and translate it for their own contexts, their home countries.
And the analysis highlights that the methods are transferable too. The tactical playbook, they call it. It's portable. Right.
That's a key insight. Foreign conservative movements, maybe populists in Europe, Catholic groups in Latin America, faith-based parties in Africa or Asia, they can watch what happened in the U.S. and learn. They see the formula. Use this powerful language of moral renewal, combine it with effective social media mobilization, channel the energy through existing church networks.
So they're not just adopting the ideas, they're copying the strategy, the organizational blueprint that seemed to work.
Exactly. It's mimicry. They adapt the successful patterns, the emotional framing, the mobilization techniques to their own local political situations. They don't have to reinvent the wheel.
And the potential end result of that.
If this dynamic really takes hold, the analysis suggests we could see the formation of stronger transnational conservative alliances, a kind of global conservative cultural ecosystem sharing not just ideology, but a proven strategy for winning influence and shaping policy. So if we take this potent, mix the intense fervor plus the institutional backing, and project it forward, what could the next 20 or 30 years look like? The analysis, quite wisely, I think, doesn't offer one single prediction. Instead, it lays out three possible paths, three potential scenarios for how this resurgence might unfold.
Right. Let's get into those, starting with what looks like the most successful outcome for the movement itself. Scenario A, the high-energy path. They also call it dominant resurgence. We can take all this, okay. Success here means to move in. The movement manages to translate that huge wave of cultural capital, the moral energy from the sacrifice narrative into lasting, durable policy change. It's not just about winning elections. It's about embedding the conservative ethical worldview into the long-term structures of society. And the policy areas they focus on are pretty fundamental, aren't they? Education, immigration, family policy, even changing the norms of public debate.
Yes, exactly. Because those are the levers that shape culture over generations. So, in education, maybe successful pushes for curriculum changes, emphasizing traditional values or religious history, or more funding for school choice. For family policy, perhaps laws reinforcing traditional marriage definitions or strengthening parental rights. And critically, a shift in public discourse towards valuing rules and order more explicitly, maybe giving institutions more leeway to enforce moral standards.
And what about internationally under this high-energy scenario?
Internationally, this path would see the movement's influence really pushing that sovereignty-first, tradition-emphasizing agenda we talked about, putting serious pressure on international bodies, the WHO, UN agencies, forcing them to adapt or maybe even face restructuring efforts led by this new conservative bloc.
So this is the scenario where the movement really matures into a stable, mainstream political force globally.
That's the idea, influencing diplomacy, trade, global norms in very concrete ways across multiple nations.
Okay, now let's look at the middle option. Scenario B, the mixed path, also called regional realignment, sounds like partial success, but with a lot more conflict.
That's a good way to think about it. Here, the outcome is uneven. You see significant cultural and political wins in countries where that conservative infrastructure was already strong, perhaps the US, maybe some parts of Eastern Europe, certain Latin American nations. But at the same time, the movement runs into really strong, effective pushback in more secular societies.
Like Western Europe, maybe some parts of Asia.
Exactly. Places with strong liberal traditions and institutions that actively resist the conservative push.
So what happens then when you have success here but strong backlash there?
You get sharper cultural divisions globally. Fault lines deepen between regions. The movement might become dominant domestically in some places, changing laws and culture there, but its global reach is limited. You end up with a kind of fragmented world order, lots of ideological clashes in international forums, but no single dominant trend globally, a real patchwork map of influence.
And then there's the third possibility. Scenario C, the reverse path. This one's called backlash and stagnation. This sounds like where it all goes wrong for the movement.
It is. This is the scenario where the movement essentially fails its own internal tests, leading to its own decline.
Triggered by what? What are the risks?
The analysis points to specific triggers. Significant overreach, where the movement pushes too far, too fast. Practices that are widely seen as exclusionary or discriminatory. Cases of clear institutional injustice linked to the movement. Or, and this is a grim possibility, more violence that gets credibly associated with the movement's rhetoric or followers.
So if the passion, the fervor, starts to ignore or override basic principles of fairness or law, it backfires.
Precisely. It generates its own undoing. The result is a significant long-term backlash. This leads to democratic pushback, maybe legal challenges, societal fragmentation, and ultimately, the movement gets contained, maybe even stopped, by the legal system.
So the energy gets spent fighting battles rather than building anything lasting.
Exactly. It leads to stagnation, that window of opportunity that awakens and closes pretty quickly. And what's left is often just deeper cultural division and cynicism. The potential for real reform gets lost.
So looking at these scenarios, particularly the difference between that high-energy path and the backlash path, it really seems to boil down to the movement's own choices, doesn't it? It's self-awareness.
Absolutely. The analysis is very clear on this. The ultimate trajectory isn't predetermined. It hinges critically on whether the movement can navigate some fundamental ethical challenges.
The sources lay out 3 core requirements, 3 tests, for achieving long-term legitimacy and avoiding that Scenario C outcome.
Yes, and this is really the central tension, isn't it? Can all that moral fervor, that energy be channeled into institutional practices that are actually just and unifying? Or does it just become another source of division? It's about integrating conviction with civic responsibility.
Okay, let's break down these tests. The first one, respect for pluralism and the rule of law. This feels like a major friction point for any deeply convicted movement in a diverse society.
It's arguably the critical test for long-term acceptance in modern democracies. The challenge is huge. How does the movement hold firm to its core religious and moral beliefs, its identity, while also genuinely respecting the rights of minorities and strictly following established legal processes?
So it's about working within the system, not trying to bulldoze it.
Exactly. The moment it looks like they're using power to ignore the law or suppress the rights of those who disagree, even those they find offensive, that's when the institutional legitimacy starts to crumble. That's the trigger for the backlash in Scenario C. It has to prove it's a constitutional force, not a revolutionary one.
Okay, test number 2 seems equally vital, especially given how this all started, a nonviolent political culture.
可以
And the demand here is absolute. Leaders, organizations, especially churches involved, they must actively reject escalating rhetoric.
Yeah.
They have to be completely committed to peace and order, especially when emotions are running high, like during protests or elections.
Even just the language used matters. Rhetorical violence.
The analysis suggests yes. Language that dehumanizes opponents or seems to incite aggression carries immense risk, because failure here, if violent rhetoric, or worse, actual violence, becomes associated with the movement, even on the fringes.
It leads straight to that social fragmentation and injustice.
Precisely. The movement has to be vigilant in policing itself, in condemning violence unequivocally. If it doesn't, it hands its opponents the perfect narrative to paint the entire movement as dangerous and anti-democratic. This test is non-negotiable for survival in a democracy. And the third test gets to the heart of motivation: integrity in public discourse.
Oh, Yusa. This is about spiritual and moral credibility, really. The requirement is straightforward. The movement's actions must align with its words. It needs to back up its moral claims with genuine integrity and a commitment to public service that benefits everyone, not just its own followers.
Because the danger is...
The danger is that the powerful religious language, all the talk of sacrifice, awakening, moral renewal, becomes just a tool, a purely political instrument used to gain power, stripped of real spiritual conviction.
And if people start to see it that way, as cynical or opportunistic,
Then its persuasive power evaporates. It's easily exposed, the analysis warns. That initial spiritual capital, the moral authority generated by the tragedy, it gets spent very quickly.
it undermines its own foundation.
Exactly. Enduring political change, the sources argue, needs enduring moral authority. And that authority depends entirely on perceived sincerity and integrity.
So the door's been opened structurally. The catalyst happened. The authorization was given. But whether the movement walks through that door successfully depends entirely on navigating these ethical tightropes. Well, the analysis we've been digging into today certainly emphasizes the profound ethical and spiritual dimensions responding to these powerful political events. Before we conclude our deep dive, the source material includes a prayer, and we're mandated to share it now as a moment of reflection. Let me read that. Reading prayer. Almighty God, source of justice and mercy, in the midst of grief and uncertainty, we seek your consolation. Comfort the bereaved, heal wounded hearts, and guide our leaders with wisdom that honors both truth and the dignity of every human being. May faith communities witness with humility, love, and a commitment to peace. Help us convert sorrow into service and conviction into compassion. In Christ's name, amen.
To quickly summarize, then, the core argument we've unpacked today. That combination of Charlie Kirk's death, the emotional catalyst, and the president's UN speech, the institutional mandate, really has created a significant structural possibility for a conservative resurgence, potentially globally. It's a genuine moment of opportunity for the movement.
But with huge caveats.
Huge caveats. The analysis is crystal clear. Whether this potential translates into a lasting positive force or simply deepens polarization depends entirely on how the movement handles those three ethical tests we discussed: respect for law and pluralism, commitment to nonviolence, and genuine integrity. The possibility is there, but the outcome is absolutely not guaranteed. It depends on choices.
Which leads us perfectly into a final challenging question for you, our listeners, to think about. The sources stress that this movement needs to avoid fracturing society, avoid exclusionary practices while still holding firm to its strong convictions. So practically speaking, in the messy reality of politics and policy, how do you define that line? When does a religious movement's effort to influence civic life, say through education reform, cross over into becoming exclusionary or harmful to minority rights? Where does conviction become overreach? Something to definitely ponder. Thank you for participating. See you next time.